I mean, it started with your interest and with the Squaw Valley and with the Olympics.
The untold story.
Right.
And there's been a documentary that came out this year called Miracle in the Mountains, and about all these firsts of the 1960 Winter Olympics. And I went to the screening of the documentary. The producer called me looking for research and information. And he didn't mention what I think is the most important story, the most important first. And I was just like, are you kidding me? In 2022, and he went into production on that in late 2020. Like, really? Are you kidding me? So this part of the story that's not being told. And a lot like the 1619 project, if you're an academic, there wasn't anything new in the 1619 project. We knew that. But it was sharing it with the greater public. And that's what I want to do with your thesis, with your story, is like share it with all of you. And I want you to go tell your friends.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And I do appreciate it. I had no idea about this. As I said, I had no idea about the Winter Olympics until I started doing this research. And then it was like, oh my gosh, and the fact of the matter is, so many folks here, in Nevada and Reno especially, have no idea how connected we were to what was going on nationally. And that's the big thing about this, is that, Reno, Nevada, that's out there, way out there in Nevada. They're not involved, with the civil rights movement. They don't know about this. And the thing about it is that there are a couple things that were very interesting about this time. Charles Keller was an attorney who was sent to Nevada by the Chief Justice, Thurgood Marshall. He was sent to Nevada as an attorney. Here we are, there's this whole movement, Thurgood Marshall is sending attorneys, all around the country trying to help them to participate and get, in the civil rights movement. It's another story that probably should be told someday. Who else? What other places did he send attorneys to, like he sent to Nevada? So there was that happening. So we had this hotshot attorney from Brooklyn who came to Nevada. He couldn't get, they wouldn't accept him in the bar here, so he had free time. So what does he do? He comes up to Reno. He comes up to Reno and works with the NAACP here. He works with Eddie Scott. And the two of them, they were the heroes to the story. They're the superstar, the dynamic duo of this whole story that kept pushing and getting everybody to gather together, to march and to picket and to do all these things. It was this guy from Brooklyn, and an unemployed president of the NAACP. But they were part of this whole national movement. And I don't think that a lot of people realize that we had our own part in it, here in Reno.
And I think too, what's so important is that it wasn't just this localized effort. The family that you saw the pictures in the video at the Olympic Games, that was Turia Hal Pittman, who was the director of the Western region for the NAACP, and she and her family are in Oakland, or were in Oakland. This was a huge regional effort. It wasn't just Reno, that support that came from so many places is just, I didn't label this. I couldn't figure out how to label it and have it work visually. But the day that the Civil Rights Act is signed in Nevada, Taria Hall Pittman is standing at Governor Sawyer's right side. She's right next to him. And I know enough about photography that when pictures like that are taken, she was put at directly to his right, I think for a very symbolic reason.
Mhm.
And that was this idea, I think that in Northern California, they had a better picture of the crisis that was unfolding here than most people in the community here had.
Well, yeah, I think that also that, looking at the numbers, the African American population here in Reno, in this area, has been 2% of the total. I mean, it's still, I think it's now like 2.6%. So it's still always been a fairly small percentage of the total population. There in Northern California, and California was, they had larger numbers and there were more people, African American people, in a larger stance there. So I think that they understood more than, here in Reno, and they were able to help and push this and encourage this movement here. And thank goodness that we had, we're so close to, Northern California that we could do that. Because, they really, just in looking at the letters and looking at the interaction between the NAACP, the Western region and Northern California and Reno Sparks, there was a lot of communication going back and forth. And Miss Pittman, she definitely was there and very active in what was going on here, in Northern Nevada.
Yeah.
Very much.
It was, as you identified in your thesis, it was a catalyst. It was a key turning point. And I still can't believe that the story isn't more widely known. I think that's the thing that still really just shocks me. I was in an Uber yesterday to pick up my car from the mechanic and just chit-chatting. And third generation native, Reno born, had no idea. And so I gave him the link to the video and said, here, go home and watch this. His wife used to be the secretary for Dr. Mark Johnson, the former president of the university. And it just amazes me that people don't know the story.
Well, I mean, I guess I'm not amazed anymore because, we'll look at what is taught in our schools, and you think about African American history isn't taught. I mean, I don't think most of this history hadn't even been written until I wrote it. That's 2019, and so. And that's just a little old thesis. So, it's not, the fact of the matter is, who's going to tell it? Who's there to tell this history? Who's telling it? Nobody.
But you did.
And you did. We did.
Keep telling you that now it's time for a book, because I think that there's a place for that. Because you have so much spare time, right?
Oh, lots, plenty.
One of the things, there's always this, what part of the story do I tell? And there's always what ends up in the notes in the file that doesn't get included. And you had shared with me in the interview, and I think y'all might like to hear about this, about the oral histories that you conducted, because those people are now all gone.
Yeah, they're dead.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But, Alice Smith, for starters.
Eddie Scott.
Yeah.
I mean, I spent hours, talking to him. He was the president of the NAACP, and he was elected president in 1960, won by 2 votes. And the old timers, and he was kind of like considered this, kind of young whippersnapper type dude. And the old timers didn't want him to be the president. And they petitioned and went to Ms. Pittman saying that, trying to get him, out of office. And she said, no, he is your president. It was a, legal vote, and he's president. So he won by 2 votes. Thank God, because he really went after it, as president. He wasn't one of these, this old timers that was going to sit back, go, yes, ma'am, no, ma'am. He was out there ready to fight. And that's what the NAACP needed at that time. And he did it. So Eddie Scott, I spent hours talking to him. I spent, time talking to Dolores Feemster, who a lot of people now, they're trying to make this, school named after her. But there were people like that who I call them the foot soldiers. I think Dolores Feemster was a foot soldier. She in the movement, and there were quite a few that were foot soldiers in the movement at that time that were ready and willing, to get out there and march around, the state capitol and picket. They were picketing Woolworths after, that was a national call. After the Woolworths, they picketed in North Carolina. The NAACP said, we're going to picket all the Woolworths across the country, and that included Reno. And a lot of folks here in Reno were like, wait a minute, that's one of the only places we can go eat. How can we picket this place? But they did. They were out there. These foot soldiers were out there. They picketed. Bertha Woodard was one of them. And she had a schedule, and she got folks to get out there at a certain time and, picket in front of, the Woolworths here in Reno. So those were the rich stories that I was able to capture, in talking to these folks. And, you're right, they're gone now. But I'm, very grateful that I was able to talk to a lot of these people before they died and get their stories, and get them down on paper.
You told me a great story, again, something else that's not in here, about Harry Spencer.
Well, Harry Spencer, a white man, he was the publicist at that time. He was a big publicity person for the Mapes and for the Riverside Hotel. And he told me a lot of stories, but the one story I remember during the Olympics was Sammy Davis Jr. Sammy Davis Jr. was to perform. He performed at the Mapes during the Olympics. And in prior times when Sammy Davis Jr. came to town, he was not allowed to stay at the Mapes. He had to stay at a boarding house that was run and owned by an African-American woman. But during the Olympics, he was allowed to stay there. He didn't have to go through and enter through the freight elevator.
He got to come in the front door.
He could go in the front door. First time, he was finally allowed to go through the front door at the Mapes where he was performing, was during that Olympics. And, and Harry was his, pretty much his tour guide, his chauffeur, and Harry took him up to the Olympics and spent the day with him, up there at Squaw Valley, which is now the Palisades. But he did that. He spent the day with him up there, and it was a very fond memory of his to have done that during the Olympics. So,
that's the way it was for Black performers when they came to Reno. They had to go in through the kitchen. They had to take the freight elevator. The Riverside and the Mapes had lots of headliners. It was a very different environment than it is now, where when we get headliners, we get them on a Thursday when they're on their way to someplace big like San Francisco or Sacramento. They'll come here on Thursday. But back then, Reno was this huge locus of entertainment and big name entertainment. and the Black performers were coming in through the kitchen and taking the freight elevator.
Yep.
And, so there was this little window.
Right. I know several of the women who are here today, they were on my art tour last weekend. And, when I'm on my art tour, giving my art tours, I love to tell little stories. And I always, kind of trickle in. I try to put in a little Black history while I'm looking and we're talking about art. It's like, oh, look at the pretty art. Now I'm gonna tell you about Black history. And we walked by Beefy's. And, most people don't know about Beefy's and that it used to be called Landrum's. And it was one of the few places that was integrated that allowed people to eat. Black folks could go and eat there. And, when Sammy Davis Jr., when he came, he would eat there with Marilyn Monroe. I mean, that's where they ate. He was allowed to go there and eat. So, eat at Beefy's, let's keep them in business. But it was those are the kind of stories I love to tell about that, kind of like get it into Reno's history a little bit, talk about Reno's history. I do it as much as I can. But you're right, there should be a book.
There should be a book.
Should be a book.
I'd like to open it up a little bit, and if people have questions that they want to ask Geralda and Nancy, please speak up. I don't know.
Hi,
Hi.
is that Jake?
Yeah,
Hi, Jake.
there should be a book.
Thank you, Jake.
I hope you'll write it.
Coffee's on me, Jake.
So my question is, I think what you're doing is so valuable for many reasons, but one is that you're helping to narrate the civil rights struggle in the West. And conceptually, we tend to teach the civil rights struggle as being of the South. And even Dr. King's foray into Chicago when he was pelted with rocks is treated as a kind of exception. So I'm wondering how your work has given you insight into some of the similarities and differences between the civil rights struggle here in the West and the struggle in other parts of the country.
Well, I mentioned that and write about that also in the thesis because, it was different here. I mean, we didn't have the numbers. It's many of the folks, the African Americans who lived here were from the South. That, they were either had been in the military, had come through Hawthorne, the Army Depot. For several other reasons, they, made it their way to Reno. They had been in Northern California and then came over, were in Herlong at the Army Depot and came here. So there were reasons. Most of them had come from the South and had been in the South and lived in the South. And a lot of them referred to this area, referred to Nevada as the Mississippi of the West. And I heard it from almost everybody, and I still hear it from Black folks. And I learned about the moniker RENO, run every N-word out. That is something that most of the Black folks here know about and think about when they think about Nevada and Reno. How racist it is and how racist it was. But I say, Reno really wasn't the Mississippi of the West. When I look at and think about what was going on, the lynchings that were happening and all that was happening in the South, that didn't happen here. There wasn't an African-American person who was ever lynched here in Nevada. There was a lynching, but it was not an African-American person. So when I think about, the severity of all that was going on in the South, that really didn't happen here. And I always say that the racism here there was this de facto segregation. And it was a kind of a racism by osmosis. There wasn't a law that said, Black people can't do this and Black people can't do that. It was just kind of an understood situation where, white folks had their place, Black folks had their place. And Black folks knew their place was not to be a part of the white world here in Reno. And that was, it was just kind of this silent, understood, situation that was happening here. And that's a big difference from the South. So, it was, and I think that it's taken a long time for that kind of understanding of the fact that there was a Jim Crow situation here in, Reno and in Nevada, because there wasn't that a lot of the violence that there was in the South. That wasn't going on here. It was just, your place and you stay in your place.
But did you see a lot of the systemic segregation as far as, say, housing or opportunities in higher education at the university? So.
Oh, yeah, definitely. There's definitely, I know, Jake, yeah, you can bring that up. We've mentioned and talked about the restricted covenants that, on people's, on housing, on their homes and their deeds, where, their people of color were not allowed to buy homes in certain areas here in Reno, especially like in the old Southwest. You just weren't allowed, you knew your place. You were not allowed to go there. So there were those restricted covenants that existed here in Reno. So there, it was, the systemic racism started and was there and is still ever present.
And
Yeah.
wasn't there an area, I saw this not too long ago, that blacks, where they lived, but their streets were unpaved?
Black Springs.
Black Springs, yeah.
Black Springs. Black Springs is an area north, just kind of like north of Reno, like north of Sun Valley, or like around the Sun Valley area. And it was actually, it was the land was owned by a white man, a father and son. He heard Eleanor Roosevelt speak, and he was really moved by her message. And he decided to sell his plots of land. It was like, I can't even remember the dimensions, it was like $300 to African Americans. And so African Americans would buy these plots of land in Black Springs, and they would either move houses, homes that they found, or build these homes. There were no paved roads. There wasn't sewage. It was not, it was a pretty poor area to live in, devastating area to live in. But that's where a lot of Black folks lived. They actually, it was in the late 60s that they got a HUD. They got some money through HUD. And they were writing grants at that time, and they got money, and they began to improve their roads and get a sewage system. They got together and built a community center. And they had their own Black-run fire department. So all of these things, you think about it, was their own little Black community called Black Springs. Yeah, so that was an area that they built for themselves. But it was really, poor living, really poor conditions up there. Yeah.
And wasn't Reno itself also redlined? Dolores Feemster's son, Lonnie Feemster, who went on to head the NAACP chapter here, Lonnie told me that they had to build their house in stages because even though he worked as a lineman for PG&E and his wife was a school teacher in the school district, they couldn't get a bank loan. And Lonnie just retired, a year ago? So this is a very contemporary story. And that Reno was heavily redlined. What was, I think, interesting, because there was only one high school in Reno, they by virtue of there only being one high school, it was integrated, but not that they wanted it that way. And the families that could afford to sent their children to private school, to Catholic school, because Reno High School was integrated. But it wasn't, it was by virtue of circumstance and population, not by anything else.
Right. But the interesting thing is, like, I didn't hear a lot of stories from men and women who went to Reno High. I kept wanting to hear, the terrible stories, about what happened, how are you treated? And I didn't get that. And I really wanted to hear that, but no one really was saying, they didn't give me any terrible stories. And so that was surprising to me. It's like, you hear about, down south, or, you hear about, how kids were treated going into schools. That didn't happen here. If it did happen, they're not telling the stories. If it did happen, it's, was quietly, managed. Since I've lived here, just in the last, 5 years, I've gone twice to Reno High School for a Black student who was being mistreated, and talked to the principal and met with the principal at Reno High. I personally did that, and spoke up against the racism and the bullying that was happening at Reno High School. And that's just in the past 5 years. So, it's still going on, but then the interesting thing was I just expected to get a lot more of that, and I didn't get it. Yeah.
I've had similar experiences with some of the other interviews. I talked to Luther Mack, who's hugely involved in the business community. And he went to Reno High. I think he graduated in 1962. He was on the ski team at Sky Tavern. And I talked to him. I'm like, so what was he like? He's like, it's high school. It's fine.
Yeah.
I'm like, wait a minute. Where's the? No, it's high school. It was fine.
Well, his sister was part of my interviews, oral histories.
Mhm.
Bertha Mullins was his sister. And the interest, they have an interesting story. They came from the South, took the train, lived in Hawthorne. Their father worked for the ammunitions depot at the district depot in Hawthorne. And that was one of the most racist areas in Nevada, was Hawthorne, Nevada. It was bad. Worse than Reno.
Wow.
Yeah, Hawthorne was horrible. And the base commander there was so racist and definite and segregated the soldiers at that time. So it was terrible at that time there, and that's where they lived, and then moved from Hawthorne up to Reno. And still, I was waiting, I'm gonna get some juicy stuff here. Didn't. And sometimes I wonder about that, and I wonder if it's, a religious, connection, and that, you just don't talk about those things. You just don't, it's all fine and good, because they had to have been experiencing some, racism here in Reno, and it could not have been all, it was just high school and just fine.
But, when you talk about that, there was this understanding of, this is my space, my place, this is your space and your place. Dick Doorworth, his dad was the manager of the New China Club, which was the only casino in town that was open to everybody. It was owned by Bill Fong.
There was the Harlem Club.
That's true. I keep forgetting
Don't
about
forget the Harlem Club.
The Harlem Club. And Dick used to go into Harry's bar on 4th Street, which was a Black-owned bar. And Dick would go walking in, this tall, skinny white kid, who, by the way, was also underage as a high school student. And everybody in the bar would be like, what are you doing in here? And then Harry behind the bar would say, that's Doorworth's kid. And Dick would sit down at the bar and have a drink. But there was like this very clear differentiation. And that was probably, and I haven't done the interviews that you have, but that was probably the closest that I got to that story that told me something about the racial tensions. Because, I mean, I think one of the other shocking things I learned from your thesis, like one of the things that just had me riled up at the beginning, was about the Clavern, the Ku Klux Klan here, that the Clavern in the Reno Sparks area per capita was one of the largest in the country. And I met a gentleman, his dad had a dry cleaning business in Carson City. And he said that when he was working there in the late 60s and early 70s, that the Klansmen were still bringing in their robes to be dry cleaned.
You know, I keep going to garage sales, estate sales, thinking one day I'm going to get one of those. I'm going to find one. I just know that some grandparent somewhere has got one tucked away in a trunk. Gotta have it. And that's another thing. And I always, I think about that, yes, that the KKK was here and, per capita, largest, membership in the country. Talk about, standing for something.
And cross burnings on Piedmont.
Yeah, we had a cross burning right here on Truckee, at the Truckee, downtown Reno. There was a cross burning, and so you think about that, and that was in the early 1930s. But you think about that. That's somebody's grandma, grandpa, that belonged to the KKK, proud card-carrying members of the KKK here in Reno. These folks are proud of, how many people are proud to be from Reno? You always talk about, oh, I'm a proud Nevada, I'm a proud Renoite. I've lived here, my granddaddy lived here. And I think, whenever they tell me that, I'm like, was your granddaddy, great-granddaddy a member of that? I have to think about that and wonder. I don't think, oh, gee, he was out there riding horses and buckarooing. I think about perhaps he was wearing a white robe.
Yeah. And we have discussions. This is Dr. Vanage, who is my advisor. He gave me this little, literally a 1.5-inch square Post-it with a call number, no title, no author, no nothing, and said, go to the library. And I wandered through the stacks and I pulled down this thesis and then sat on the floor and then came back 2.5 hours later, just in like exhilarated and shocked and all of these things. But we have these conversations about how to find those people, how to find somebody who's willing, who would remember those stories, that's willing to talk. And we've spent hours going through newspapers looking for the ads, because they had to have placed ads in the newspapers to get people to come to these cross burnings. And we're looking for a needle in a haystack. The good news is we know where that haystack is, but let me tell you,
Well, I have taking that story, even bringing it present, I moved to Reno in 2002. And I moved here as the diversity reporter for the Reno Gazette-Journal. So that's pretty much where I started writing stories about race and Black history, Native American history, all the different histories here. That started at the Reno Gazette-Journal. And I'll never forget, it was a Friday. Now I'm Jewish, right? Okay, I just throw that out there. But it was a Friday, and my editor says, hey, I really want you to cover this. And I'm like, okay, what do you want me to cover on a Friday night? And it was a KKK meeting that was being held across the street from UNR at the bar up there across the street from UNR.
Wow.
Now, all right, so this is like early 2000s, right? Reno, KKK meeting. And I said, hell no, I'm not going to that. You know, you know, that's not happening. You can fire me today. You know, I am not going to a KKK meeting. I might be the diversity reporter, but I'm an African-American woman. At that time, I had dreadlocks. You know, there was no way I was ever going to set foot in that
Did he
meeting.
send somebody else?
Yes, he did. Yes, he did.
Okay,
I'm
we're
not
gonna
going to tell you who.
We're gonna have to talk later.
Yeah, but
We're
he
gonna
did.
have to talk later.
Another reporter did have to go cover that. Yes,
Was that the wall?
yes,
Wow.
yes.
Was it reported in the paper?
No. No. But we did go. The reporter did go. So the reporter no longer works for the Reno Gazette Journal.
Who is the editor then?
Now you really want to get.
I'm just wondering if it was Warren, because I've been trying to get him to talk about all kinds
Okay,
of things.
no.
Yeah, he doesn't.
2002.
It was a major student bar. There would have been a lot of students there on Friday night. So it would be-
Yeah, right. It was a big, heavy-duty student bar, yeah. But I wasn't going on a Friday night. So I wasn't going, period. But, but that's kind of like even, you talk about KKK, that brings it forward here.
Mhm.
And, you know, now we have lots of even other hate groups that are, you know, out here doing their
Yeah.
thing. Racist hate groups. So, but are there any other questions? Yes.
That Woolworth picket, I don't quite understand. You said that blacks could eat there, but then they picketed there
Right.
specifically against that Woolworth, or was that a countrywide thing?
That was a country, that was nationwide, that the NAACP nationwide, they sent out saying to all their branches saying, we want you to picket the Woolworths. We want this to be a national movement. And so because it was a national movement to picket the Woolworths, that's why we picketed the one here. So, yeah.
Is the old Woolworths where City Hall is now today? No.
It's right across
Across
from
the
the
street.
Bruca, same
Okay.
side of the street as.
The Bruca, yeah.
But why wouldn't have they gone to another business that was not as friendly? Was it just so that?
It was the fact that it was the Woolworths, and that was, you know, what was where the young black men sat at the counter at the sit-in in North Carolina. So we were following suit.
Okay.
There was a question.
Thank you.
Yes.
Two kind of related questions. First, with the oral histories that you did for your thesis, did those get deposited into an archive somewhere? And second, for both of you, in terms of doing like archival and historical research, I'm guessing there was difficulty in doing that and that there were some gaps in terms of collecting. So I was just wondering if you each could speak to that a little bit and kind of how you went about doing that. Since I know sometimes you have to do roundabout ways to try and find the material you're looking for.
Well, luckily, there was a professor emeritus, Elmer Rusko. He was in the political science department, and I had read Elmer's book and written as a reporter about him and had talked to him. And he was diagnosed with Lou Gehrig's disease, and he was moving. So he asked me to come to his home, and I did. And he said, "Listen, Geralda," he says, "I've got lots of research here. I've done a lot of work." He says, "And I'm showing you this." And he says, "And I want you to write the story." He says, "You've got to use my information." And so that was what I used mostly when writing my thesis. I started there. I mean, he had I think, a good 11 boxes of material that was at the historical, it's at the Historical Society. So that's where I started. And I knew a lot of people having been a reporter. And I used, luckily my reporting skills and to identify people that I knew, I should talk to. And what I did was I had them sign releases, and they released all their information to me, and so that I own it. I did not want anybody else to own what they were telling me in case I ever wanted to use it for something else. I said the best way for me to do this is to have them sign release forms. So they all signed releases, giving the information to me. So that's how I did it.
And then, so you bring up a really interesting question. And I just read a book last week. And out of this 300 pages in the book, the one line that has stuck with me is that an archive is a symbol of what's been lost. And we have these letters from the NAACP leaders. Most of the NAACP files are at UNR and special collections, and then the rest is in Lonnie Feimster's living room. And Senator Alan Bible, who is a US Senator from Nevada, he was the head of the Appropriations Committee, and he was in charge of all of the money that was appropriated for the Olympics. So he got all of these letters, and his collection is at special collections at UNR. And so I went looking for the organizing committee, which is the group that is responsible for pulling off these games in real time. They had meetings, and there were minutes of the meetings. Down at the Bancroft at UC Berkeley is Governor Brown's collections, and there are letters that reference minutes of the meeting. The minutes are gone. I thought the IOC had them. The IOC doesn't. The IOC does not have them. The USOC does not have them. They're just gone. And what I've been able to figure out, there was a parcel of land that was not owned by Squaw Valley Ski Corporation. It was owned by the state. And after the Olympics, it became a park, a state park. But in order to get to the one chairlift that they actually owned, you had to buy a lift ticket at Squaw Valley. They never figured out, okay, so we have this Olympic park, how are we going to make money? It was a giant albatross, and in 1972, they sold it to Mainline Corporation. And when they sold it, as far as I can tell, it looks like the state parks deaccessioned all the files. So they're gone. The Sierra Nevada and Olympic Winter Sports Museum up at the lake has 3 boxes of papers from Robert L. King, who is the executive director of the organizing committee. And again, references to minutes of the meeting that took place on Wednesday, January 2nd, 1957. The minutes are gone. They're just vaporized into thin air. And so there's always gaps in an archive. And this one just kind of really kills me because I want to know, what was the discussion? They get these letters, these scathing letters, and the letters are extraordinary. They're so well written and so articulate. And so here's a scathing indictment, and this committee had to have been discussing this. Senator Bible is breathing down their neck saying, you fix this or I'm going to make the money go away. And I'm in charge and I can do that. So where was this discussion? Where was this debate? And I go to yard sales hoping that somebody has a box of something. Special collections is endowed by Clarence and Martha Jones, and Clarence Jones was the head of the Nevada Civic Olympic Commission. There's 3 boxes in the Nevada State Archives, according to their catalog, related to the Nevada Civic Olympic Commission, and all 3 boxes are gone. So when you're doing research, you're always left with gaps. That's an archive is a symbol of what's been lost. And, you know, I'm always about how we need to save everything. We can't save everything, so what do we save? And somebody decided that meetings of minutes were just not worth saving.
And if you know folks with those boxes of documents, encourage them to go to the Historical Society or Special Collections to donate them.
Right, yeah, I mean, come on now, Lonnie should not have that stuff in his living room. I mean, he's the president,
And
former president of the NAACP, and that's it. I mean, like, there should be some kind of rules within these organizations like that too, that say, you know, you've got to pass on all of your information and documents, and that has to be housed either at the special collections or historical society. That should probably be in the bylaws.
well, and I've been searching, I've been on a mission since I read your thesis, because the NAACP, every chapter was really good at taking photographs and documenting things. And I am at the point where I'll pay a finder's fee, not a lot because I'm not a rich woman, but of a Reno, Nevada business where you can see the whites only sign near the entrance at eye level. I just want one stinking picture.
Well, Greta DeYoung is sitting here, and was chair of my committee for my thesis, and I remember even when I defended it, that was one of the first questions that they asked me. You know, did you ever find, you know, a sign? Did you ever find the, you know, no colors allowed sign? You know, where is it? And I'm like, no, I never did, and I looked too.
Yeah.
I wanted to have that.
And Lonnie, I guess, has a bunch of stuff from Alice Smith that Alice's daughter gave to Lonnie. There's a dozen or so boxes there. And so me, the historian, is like, when important things like that are sitting in boxes in living rooms and houses that catch fire and streets and cities that flood, and I'm like, and so it's,
Yeah.
and maybe you can help us
Right,
with
and
that.
Also, Ken Dalton, who's a
He
former
was my-
fire department,
Yeah.
he has Bertha Woodard's. He has boxes of Bertha Woodard's notes. And Bertha's a former president of the NAACP. So, I mean, it's like all these different folks have got, you know, boxes in their garages or somewhere of you know, important information
Yeah.
that it's not
This-
should be someplace special.
The stuff, just on a brief aside, Wayne Polson, who founded Squaw Valley, Alex Cushing, who ended up being the guy that came in with the money, there's a handwritten letter on that airmail, that real thin onion skin, a handwritten letter from Alex Cushing to Wayne Polson in 1948 saying, you don't ever have to worry about losing control of your company. And the first chance Alex Cushing got, he convened the board of the directors and they voted Wayne Polson out. Like, and the letter is in an envelope in a Ziploc bag in a box on the floor of Wayne's son's garage in the house that is on Squaw Creek, which in a big year will flood. And I'm like, and they pass the letter around, everybody's looking at it, I'm like, you all need to have white gloves on and like.
So are there any other questions?
Hi, I want to thank both of you for showing the video and having this discussion. It was enlightening and at some parts it was stirring. So Geralda, is there a place where I can access your thesis? And how do I get the link for the video?
There is a place where the thesis is housed, the special collections.
It's actually digitized. And I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, that you can access part of the UNR collections even though you're not a student. But her thesis, her thesis has been digitized. It's The Biggest Little Struggle.
Black activism in Reno, 1954 to 1965.
But even if you have trouble accessing it outside of you can go to the library and get a temporary borrower card for the day, gain access and just download that like
Yeah. Yes, Tanya.
Now that the Gender, Race, and Identity department at UNR is doing a Black Studies minor, do we know if this project will be included in?
Gosh, I hope so.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I hope so.
Assigned
You know,
viewing?
people-
Yeah, I don't know anything about that, but I'm glad, happy to hear it.
Yeah, they just announced it, I think not even a week ago via email, so I think it would be super useful if it was involved in the curriculum.
I was actually gonna send the link to Dr. Gales,
Yeah.
now that I'm not a student, because we were in a gender, race, identity class together, and I didn't wanna, in the middle of the class, I'm just like trying to be a good student and do my job, and I meant to send it to her and I never did, so thank you for reminding me, because I think she's chairing that.
I think so, I'll
Yeah.
email you,
Okay.
but yeah, I think it would be great and useful.
Yeah, well, and especially because a good portion of those primary source materials are here between the Historical Society and Special Collections. And one of the things, when I talked to you about writing your book, there's more of this story. Donnie Curtis, who's now retired, was the outreach librarian for Special Collections. And she found a letter in the SNCC file from Dr. King to Dr. Armstrong, who is then president of the university, days after the Nevada Civil Rights Act was signed, looking for students to come to the South. And in fits and starts, I've been communicating with the King Center, trying to find out if anybody from
Went.
Reno went, and then to track down those people. But there's a letter just sitting in a folder signed by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. And like when Donnie, she says, hey, come by, I found something. And she pulls out this folder and I see the letterhead and I'm like, and it's a 2-page letter. So, got to get on the gloves and turn the page. And so there's a story there in the SNCC file at UNR. That's a whole resource that hasn't been dug into yet. And so to continue to tell these stories, and that's really cool that we're going to have that.
You had another question?
Yes, has this video been aired on KNTV or is it not able to, or where is the?
I would love it. We just haven't
You're
got
totally
that far.
welcome to.
We just haven't got that far. I've actually, so at UNR, our dynamic media lab and our studio and everything is an extraordinary facility. It's broadcast quality. And Dan Fergus, who's now the director, and Mark Gandolfo, who just retired, have been talking to me about that conversation. There's some more work that we need to do because at 27 minutes, it's not long enough. I mean, they could air it, but ideally they would like it to fill the hour. So I need to actually, and there is more material. There's more photographs, more stories, more of the interview. Governor Sawyer had 30 hours. And there's actually more than an hour where he's specifically talking about the Civil Rights Movement and the Civil Rights Act. So there's actually more to be added to it. And that we just haven't got that far. But
That'd be a great stage to put your request out for more archives. At the end of the show or somewhere in the show.
Yeah,
But it has to be an hour?
Well, actually, I think it's 47 minutes because they need time for their commercial breaks. And I don't know why I have that number in my
Well,
head.
it's only 20 minutes.
I've got it.
Come on now. Come on, Nancy.
Yes.
Hi, Ms. Geralda. I wanted to jump back to Jake's question, talking about the differences in the movement in the South versus here. So how do you think your contribution to first I want to say, I think it's intentional that we only focus on the most overt, violent parts of the movement And I think it kind of absolves some of the responsibility that we still have now to like the more subtle parts. So how do you think your contribution to like rounding out this history is going to help us today?
Well, I think that it's a good starting point for anyone who wants to go further. I mean, I think that it's, it's rich enough and has a lot of, good information in it that would allow someone to even, to take it and go further with it. Because, and I do think it's interesting because I sent the video to my only African-American professor I've ever had, who was my professor at Southern Methodist University in Dallas. And I sent him the video and he wrote me back going, "Oh my gosh, Geralda, I had no idea that that was the way it was out west." And he's an African-American professor, in Dallas, Texas. So I think that, there's still a lot more that we can do. And this was just a good beginning to that. Because there is just a lack of understanding about what was going on here in the West. I guess it was January of 2019, January, right before COVID hit, 2020. I was part of the cowboy poetry. They had the theme of that year was black cowboys. And so they asked me to come out and be a part of their weekend cowboy poetry gathering. And what I found, even, talking to, I, met with a woman from Oregon who told the story about her grandfather, Black man going up there and being in the logging industry up there, and a very rich story that no one, had not been told before. So there are plenty of stories about the civil rights movement, activism here in the West that haven't been told, that, should be a part of the story, because there is a tie to what was going on in the South with what was happening here in the West as well. Yeah.
I think it's really about, knowledge is power. And the more that we talk about this, the more that we bring this into the collective conscious conversation, the idea that this was happening here and it's still happening here. And, the question that you asked in the interview is like, what can I do now?
But the interesting thing is, we're sitting here right now, we're talking about this, and look what's happening all around the country with our school boards and with the schools. I mean, there are so many people right now that are trying to get rid of, African-American history, calling it critical race theory, So we have this movement, it's a national movement that is happening right now. And Reno is a part of it. They're starting right now. There's a wealthy man, last name Breedles, however you pronounce his last name. He has put thousands of dollars into different school boards across the country, including Reno. And they're trying to right now recall Angie Taylor, African-American, head of our school board. All in the fact and all because they're claiming that, they're trying to teach critical race theory in our schools. That's bullshit. We know that. It's not critical race theory. They're just trying to get rid of African-American history in our schools. So, we've got a lot to fight for here. There's a lot that here, even in little old Reno, and once again, we have got to get to our school board meetings. We have got to say, hey, African-American history is important. It belongs in our schools. We've got to teach this. And if we don't do that now, we've got a bunch of right-wingers that are going to be in office, that are going to be on our school boards across the country, that are going to silence this and keep it out of the system. It's gonna happen.
I'll just point out that for the last 2 years, a friend of ours who's a retired principal for a high school in the area, and other retired people have been doing a guerrilla action on Facebook just because of that, to defend the teaching of history, broadly, African American history. It's ongoing, it's been ongoing. It's not always visible. You see part of it at the school board meetings, but it's also on social media.
You know, it's, you know, so who's going to our school board meetings? It's the right wingers.
Yeah.
They're the ones that are going, they're the squeaky wheels out there. Everybody else is sitting back, not going, afraid. They're afraid of these folks. And maybe they, you know, it's like, should they be? Yeah, I guess you should. But if you don't go and you don't fight that, what's gonna happen?
Yeah.
Yeah, what's gonna happen? We're not gonna be teaching Black history in our schools.
Well, I think some schools, that was never a choice, really. It was intentional. And I'm just speaking because I taught for Washoe County School District for 29 years. And the last several years, I taught the Civil Rights Movement. And that was not popular as far as administrators and, no, this is not something we do here, no. But these are white schools, really predominantly white schools here in Reno. I also grew up here. I've lived here since 1960. And and I went to Catholic schools here. And in fact, I just read a book that I thought was just amazing. I just finished it yesterday. One of my classmates at St. Thomas wrote this book, Helen Townsend, I Cried for Help.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's like, wow, I knew almost everybody in their family. We did, my siblings, and it was really moving. It was very, very moving. And yes, there's so much that we need to do here. Burnout is kind of an issue that sometimes happens when you really get into this work.
You know, when people tell me that, or when I hear that, and I always say, you know, and I have to go back and go, well, you're burnt out. You know, I hear white folks saying that. I'm tired. I'm burnt out. What do you think? We've been living this now for how long? We've been doing this. You can't say you're tired. You can't say, how dare you say I'm burnt out? How dare you say you're tired?
Yeah.
You know, when I can go back and look at the decades that, you know, I've had to act and do this and experience racism or segregation and all of this. And somebody who's been doing it for 5 minutes is gonna say, I'm tired? I have a hard time with that. And I have a hard time, and that's my, you know, with anyone telling me, you know, oh, I can't do this, I'm tired, I'm burnt out, and I can't. I said, well, you know, look at your Black friends, look at your Black neighbors who've had to, you know, who have been experiencing this all their lives. You've been doing it for like a month or whatever, and now you're tired? I just can't accept that. I think that's a major cop-out. And that's just my opinion.
There's also the problem of people not wanting to hear about it. You know, if you bring up the subject, I have a display out there right now, and I put one out there every year. And I can tell you how many books are checked out on Black History Month displays. I know because I look at it every single day. I know every single book out there. People don't want to really hear about it. They don't want to talk about it. When you bring it up, it's this again, you know, we already know about it. Well, actually, we don't know about it. We weren't taught this in school. We haven't studied this. it hasn't been solved. It's not all, we're not post-racial.
Right.
That-
Oh, well, wait a minute, we are, because we had a black president.
But I think that's such an important point that people don't want to talk about this. And I can't tell you how many times white people have said to me, why are you telling this story? It's not your story to tell us, but it is my story to tell. This, one of the things that I edited out here is when you said this is all of our history, I had said it too. And I edited it out because that was your moment. That was a creative choice. But all of the time, I have my white friends say, why are you telling this story? This isn't your story to tell. And I'm like, but it is my story. This is our story. Now I just want to pick up the 1619 Project book. I want to carry one around with me so that when people say that, I can just whack them over the head and say, read the damn book. And interestingly, my black friends say things like, I knew you were listening. When we were drunk in college and talking, I knew you were listening. And, and that was the way that I was raised. With my mother in San Francisco protesting, I was raised that this is our problem, this is our story. But it's, until everybody has a seat at the table, nobody has a seat at the table.
And the work of equity is long work.
Yeah, it is.
Just have to keep at it.
I mean, come on, we're just now getting a nomination for a black Supreme Court justice, female.
And RBG made a comment, she was asked before she died about, how many women on the Supreme Court will be enough, and she said 9. There have been 9 men on the Supreme Court, and that nobody ever had a complaint about that. So yeah, when there's 9 women on the Supreme Court, that'll be enough. And it's, we take our baby steps. We do what we can with what we've got where we are.
Do you have any more questions? Any more comments?
Just thank you. I really appreciate what's being done.